Pressiona el Barça, talla la pilota Deco l'envia per la dreta per Xavi, assistència de Xavi, més cap a la dreta per...
If you're watching something like this, I'm certain you've heard of a football war, a brief Central American conflict. Given its title, it's been thoroughly mistreated and overall reduced to that of a joke. The root cause of this war has been generally misunderstood by a larger audience. Obscured behind its name and its background, public imagination has treated it as an issue with football or soccer hooliganism, while the real issues are socioeconomic. The conditions for violence and conflict had already existed at the time of these football matches. Internationally, we recognize the war as being the football war, but scholars like Oscar Garcia, Perez Pineda, Oliver Lewis, and Tamir have suggested that the football war narrative is a myth, created by a lack of documentation, misframing of events, and the desire for an easy answer. The false narrative has entirely obscured the material cause for the war. El Salvador in the late 1960s was in deep water. Its lands were in desperate need for reform, as their land tenure system consisted of massive plantations, where peasants would work for the owners for a small plot of land for themselves to work on and live on. Commonly owned lands in El Salvador would be abolished all the way back in 1881, and by 1960, 0.5% of agricultural holdings held nearly 40% of all farmable land in the state. Honduras was in a similar situation, with their lands being held by transnational corporations like Dole and United Fruit. The difference between the two nations is that El Salvador is tiny and completely overpopulated, with 142 inhabitants per square kilometer, compared to that of 21 inhabitants per square kilometer in Honduras. The consequence of this would be countless Salvadorians immigrating into their northern neighbor, and by 1969, the year of the war, over 300,000 Salvadorians lived in Honduras. Honduran and Salvadorian peasants in the mid-1960s would start to occupy the idle lands held by large landowners, creating a large amount of discontent in those landowners. The president of Honduras, Colonel Osvaldo Lopez Arellano, would be pressured into passing new land reform in the nation. The only issue was that it wasn't aimed at fixing the issues of the large estates or the American fruit companies. Instead, it was directed at the Salvadorians. They would be forced back to their homeland, and any plot of land they cultivated would be forcibly given back to a Honduran instead. Additionally, the border between the two states was never fully demarcated, so their border in certain areas remained patchy and in itself was poorly guarded, leading to many undocumented immigrants crossing the border and the rise of criminal gangs that would engage in smuggling and other illegal activities. With this pretext, the Salvadorian paramilitary forces would often cross the border and engage in raiding Honduran territory supposedly in the search of criminals. What's most damning is that El Salvador's president, Colonel Julio Rivera, was actively supporting a coup against his neighbor, the president of Honduras, Lopez Arellano. In 1968, Colonel Antonio Argueta, an associate of Arellano, would be arrested by El Salvador and sentenced to 20 years in prison. In 2 weeks after this, a Salvadorian convoy consisting of 40 soldiers and 2 officers would be found attempting to enter the Honduran capital. The two presidents would soon meet on pretexts of talks on trade issues, and while they were there, they would exchange prisoners, the colonel for the members of the coup. At the time, there was no obvious connection between El Salvador and the coup. However, historian Carlos Perez Pineda, in a work from 2012, concludes that what evidence there is, the two certainly were linked. This military crisis is undoubtedly the true prelude to the war. Finally, there remains the issue of internal politics. Both nations were actively pitting each other's populations against each other in order to divert attention from national problems facing their nations. In 1967, Fidel Hernandez would be elected in El Salvador and would quickly face multiple striking unions advocating for better wages and acceptable living conditions. By 1969, his opposition, the Christian Democratic Party, threatened to cripple his presidency, but in the onset of the war he would call for national unity and would ultimately cripple his opposition and, for the moment, divert any attacks from military officials. President Arellano was also facing mounting internal opposition. The Honduran peasantry was increasingly growing hostile and continuing to voice demands for proper land reform. In 1968, a general strike also broke out on the northern coast of Honduras, supported by workers, merchants, and industrialists from the coast, as well as university students from San Pedro Sula and Tegucigalpa. Following the imposition of martial law, the strike was brutally repressed. However, a few months later, the teachers were initiating another strike. With the war against El Salvador, this strike lost momentum. The authorities took advantage of the situation to capture imprisoned leaders. President Lopez Arellano gained support for his policy of expelling Salvadorians. There still remains a question. Why have scholars accepted the title of the football war for so long? Why is this what remains? The first football match started on June 8, 1969 in the Honduran capital. However, the night preceding, the Salvadoran players were not allowed to sleep the night before the first match because of the noise of Honduran fans. There are testimonies of injuries amongst traveling supporters from El Salvador and insults and death threats against Salvadorans in the first match. Additionally, both nations' radio broadcasts were actively engaging in media campaigns that would continue to flame tensions. One such example from the press in Honduras was particularly ominous in terms of its anti-Salvadoran rhetoric. Honduran, pick up a stick and kill a Salvadoran. Honduran radio broadcasts attacked the 14 families of El Salvador, which allegedly controlled most of the nation's wealth. The match itself would end in a score of 1-0, with Honduran defenders barely winning at the 89th minute. In response to defeat, a Salvadoran fan and national martyr, Emilia Belenes, would commit suicide from being ever so distraught. This story was found to be a fabrication created by Polish historian Ryszard Kapuscinski, who additionally is credited as the creator of the name The Football War, and he was the man to suggest the war was started because of these qualifying matches. Match 2 was held on the 15th in the Salvadoran capital, and in the lead-up, just like the first match, the opposing team would be targeted by harassment and violence during their stay in the nation, with thousands of Salvadorans rioting outside their hotel. Honduran forward Jose Cardona, after the incident, reportedly said, "They brought us like convicts to the stadium. We were escorted. Our bus was stoned. I do not know how we made it through with all the unrest. If we had won the game in San Salvador, we would have not made it out there alive." The match would ultimately end with a score of 3-0 for Salvador. The violence would not end there. Rioting would continue for a week, with Honduran car windows being smashed, businesses being sacked, but yet direct violence against Hondurans themselves would not occur. The British embassy in the nation went so far to say there was some breaking of car windscreens and crowd hooliganism, but no other instance more serious than would occur elsewhere in the world, including Britain, at tense cup matches. Still though, the football war had not begun. In the following weeks, both nations' presses would start to claim more and more untruths, from mob attacks to reports of mass sexual violence. Meanwhile, reports made the day of absolutely make no reference to any of these events, and yet the Honduran Secretary of External Relations would go so far to say that attacks on Salvadorans are a legal and just reaction of the Honduran people. Tamir and Oliver Lewis both claim that these public comments directly fed into non-state violence, furthering the Salvadorans' desire to declare war. The Salvadoran population, still living in Honduras at this time, was also being forcefully expelled, with the U.S. Embassy estimating nearly 10,000 Salvadorans had been repatriated in the month of June. Additionally, a U.S. National Security Council memorandum noted that soccer matches, with their nationalist overtures, provided a good cover for Hondurans to deal with their Salvadoran immigrants. The soccer incidents provided, therefore, under the thinly disguised varnish of patriotism and national outrage, an opportunity for Honduras to even some old scores and give vent to their jealousy and resentment of the Salvadoran immigrants. The final match was on the 26th in Mexico City, with a total of 15,000 spectators. in a stadium that easily held up to 100,000, a true testament to the match's inconsequence. The day before the match was to start, El Salvador would break off all diplomatic ties to Honduras, and with this, the path of war would be truly set out. The match would go through, and El Salvador managed to win 3-2, and despite hostile chanting, violence would not ensue. El Salvador's team would continue in the World Cup, only to be defeated 3 times in a row by Mexico, Belgium, and the Soviet Union. 17 days would pass, and despite attempts at mediation, El Salvador would declare war on the 14th of July, and for 100 hours, death and violence ensued. With all this, it's possible to find why the football war is what stuck, not the propaganda war, nor the 100 Hours War. A surprisingly little known fact about the 3 matches between the two nations is that reporters were already calling it the Soccer War. It's just they were talking about the matches themselves instead of the armed conflict that would later ensue. So the label itself predated the war, and it becomes quite obvious that reporters just reused the old name as a means of sensationalism. The issue with the public perception of the conflict is based on the sensationalism that came after it. The idea of war caused by sports is a far more interesting headline than talking of issues with agrarian inequality and nationalism. Not only is it more interesting though, it's far easier to condense and understand quickly. Even in the 60s, people read the headlines and skipped the real information. The narrative of the football war also succeeds in depoliticizing the conflict, transforming a struggle born from socioeconomics into that of sports fanaticism. In doing so, we ignore the major issues present, class, and state power. Here, I find my argument aligning more and more with that of Debord. The reality of this conflict, land inequality, political instability, and displacement is gradually being reduced and replaced by something simpler and easier to consume. The war is no longer remembered for the conditions that created it, the spectacle that's been attached. As Guy Debord wrote, the spectacle is the existing order's uninterrupted discourse about itself, the self-portrait of power.